Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to our weekly explained session. The topic for today is the unprecedented economic crisis that is staring at Sri Lanka. In this session, we are going to understand the factors that have contributed to this economic crisis in Sri Lanka. We will understand how it affects the Sri Lankan people. We are going to talk about its impact on India, because Sri Lanka is a key neighbor of India and India has a role to play in the ongoing economic crisis in Sri Lanka. We'll understand how the crisis in our southern neighbor affects Indian interests as well. So before we begin, I would like to remind you to like the video, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more such engaging content on current affairs. So let's start by talking about why this topic is in news. Let's understand what is happening in Sri Lanka over the last few weeks and over the last few months. I'm sure many of you would be aware that Sri Lanka is facing one of its biggest ever crises. That is, since its independence, since 1948, Sri Lanka is clearly facing its biggest economic crisis. There are many factors which have contributed to this. As a result of this crisis, the Sri Lankan people are suffering immensely. So we need to get to the root of this problem and understand all the factors that have contributed to this crisis. In fact, in the last few months, Sri Lanka's forex reserves or foreign currency reserves, they have depleted by nearly 70%. You can see clearly in the graph that in the last 2 to 3 years, there is a massive fall in Sri Lanka's forex reserves. Today, Sri Lanka is hardly left with around $2 billion in its foreign exchange reserves. So as a result, Sri Lanka is staring at a possible default. It is staring at a situation of possible bankruptcy, where it won't be in a position to honor its debt commitments. It may not be in a position to repay the loans that Sri Lanka has borrowed from other countries and from other international institutions. Over the last few weeks, it has been reported that Sri Lanka has been facing a BOP crisis, quite similar to how India witnessed a similar crisis back in 1991. On its balance of payments, Sri Lanka is facing an immediate crisis. The shortage of forex reserves has affected Sri Lanka's ability to continue its imports. Sri Lanka is in a very difficult position to continue importing essential items. Even essential items like oil, gas, medicines, fertilizers, even these essential supplies cannot be sustained into Sri Lanka because Sri Lanka cannot pay for these imports. As a result, there is a shortage of essential items in the country. There is massive inflation. People are suffering on the ground, and this is what has led to chaos in Sri Lanka in the last few weeks. The primary reason why the crisis happened is because of the rising external debt of the country. Its external debt has ballooned over the last 15 years. Sri Lanka has borrowed a lot of money from many countries and many institutions, and today it is not in a position to pay them back. So this depletion of forex reserves has triggered the BOP crisis, a crisis on the balance of payments, and it's a result of its poor economic performance. It's a result of economic mismanagement by the government. There are also a few social and political factors which have contributed to the crisis. So we need to get a better insight into all these factors. Now let me just show you another illustration, another infographic, which will help you understand the extent of foreign debt that Sri Lanka is under. Sri Lanka has basically fallen under a debt burden, a debt trap. This graph here clearly shows how Sri Lanka's public debt has increased exponentially over the years. From 2000 to 2010 and till present, you can see a sudden and exponential increase in Sri Lanka's foreign borrowing. Today, its total debt stands at more than $50 billion, and Sri Lanka is hardly left with $2 billion in its reserves. Every year, Sri Lanka is expected to pay anywhere between $4 to $7 billion just to repay the loans. So in this situation, where will Sri Lanka get the money? Where will it get the money from to continue its imports? That's the reason why Sri Lanka had to curb its imports thus triggering a shortage of essential supplies, leading to massive inflation in the country, and eventually the people are suffering on the ground. You'll not believe that inflation levels in Sri Lanka have crossed 17 to 18%. This is nearly a 3-time increase as compared to inflation levels that existed a few months back. So this is what brings us to the situation in Sri Lanka. The consequences have been very severe. Like I said, there has been a complete disruption of essential imports as well. Since Sri Lanka doesn't have enough forex reserves left, it has not been able to import oil. It has not been able to import coal, fertilizers, paper, etc. As a result, its economy has come to a standstill. The power plants are not running. There is no sufficient coal supplies. Power plants have been shut off, resulting in massive power disruption. For 13-14 hours a day, there is no electricity in Sri Lanka. Vehicles are not able to purchase petrol and diesel to run the economy of the nation. Exams have been cancelled and postponed because the government has not been able to import paper to conduct the exams. There is a shortage of essential medical supplies and medical items. This is affecting healthcare, that too in between the pandemic. This is the situation that Sri Lanka is facing as of today. If you look at this infographic here, it shows how Sri Lanka's currency has weakened to a record level. Its currency has been devalued as compared to other global currencies, including the US dollar, the other major global reserve currencies, and even as compared to the Indian currency. Compared to the US dollar, the Sri Lankan rupee has devalued exponentially in the last few months. So Sri Lanka has to spend more to sustain its imports at a time when its forex reserves have already been depleted. This is the dire situation that Sri Lanka is facing as of today. So this has led to shortage of all essential supplies. Even basic food items are in shortage, and there is a massive inflation in their prices. Just look at the price chart that I have shared over here. The prices of all essential items have shot up exponentially, and this is affecting the people of Sri Lanka. That's the reason why inflation levels have gone up, and it has pushed the Sri Lankan people to come out onto the streets to protest against the economic mismanagement by the Sri Lankan government. The protests have hit the streets. There has been violence as well, and just a few days back, Sri Lanka even declared a state of emergency and placed a curfew in the country to deal with the escalating situation. So as of now, Sri Lanka is staring at complete economic chaos, which is opening up its political and social divides as well. In fact, the government itself lost confidence. Government ministers lost confidence in the leadership, and all the ministers, the cabinet ministers, have resigned in an unprecedented development. The entire cabinet has resigned, and the ruling party has even lost majority in the parliament. The Sri Lankan government, which is headed by President Rajapaksa and Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, they have lost the confidence, the trust of their own party members, their own ministers. They've all stepped down because they know what grave crisis the country is facing. The ruling coalition has lost majority in the parliament as well. So this is the kind of political and economic crisis that has hit the country, and this is going to deeply affect the country and the people of Sri Lanka as well. Now this crisis in our southern neighborhood is going to have an impact on India as well. India can't be free from the impact of this crisis, because any such adverse development in our immediate neighborhood will have an immediate impact on Indian influence, on Indian interests in the region. That's the reason why it's important for India to step in to help the country stabilize the situation and bring the country back to normalcy. Because any further deterioration will have an adverse impact on Indian national interests in a critical part of the Indian Ocean. Because as you know, Sri Lanka is at the very heart of the Indian Ocean region. Right? It occupies a strategic location and influence in the region. So India should be in a position to help out Sri Lanka, work with Sri Lanka to help the country overcome this crisis. But before we get there, let's understand what brought Sri Lanka to this situation. Let us carefully examine all the factors that have contributed to this economic crisis in Sri Lanka. See, according to a report of the Asian Development Bank that was brought out in 2019, Sri Lanka was facing a classic case of twin deficit economy. It was facing a classic twin deficit situation, meaning it was reporting a budgetary deficit, that is a fiscal deficit was being reported on its budget, and alongside there was a trade deficit on its current account. Now let me explain this further. See, when there is a fiscal deficit, when there is a budgetary shortfall, it means that the government is spending more. Its expenditure is much more than its revenue. This is what it indicates, right? Because of irresponsible planning and expenditure by the government, its national expenditure had shot up and it was exceeding its national income, its revenue. So Sri Lanka for many years was consistently reporting a fiscal deficit, a high fiscal deficit. For most years, it was more than 5% in the last 15 to 20 years. And such high fiscal deficits is unsustainable. Then coming to its trade account, if you look at Sri Lanka's balance of payments, its difference between its imports and exports, here as well, Sri Lanka was facing a big challenge. In the last 15 years, Sri Lanka's exports have gone down. Please make a note of this. The Sri Lankan economy was suffering domestically. Domestic production, GDP growth had been hit, and exports had declined over the last few years. Parallelly, imports had gone up exponentially. So naturally, Sri Lanka was spending more than it had. So it had to tap into its forex reserves, foreign exchange reserves, to meet this deficit. It ended up borrowing from other countries. It ended up taking loans from international lending institutions. And eventually it had to pay those loans by relying again on its forex reserves. It finally reached a situation where it had to deplete its forex reserves. It wasn't left with any more foreign currency to pay for imports and to pay for the loans that it had borrowed. So this is a classic twin deficit situation that Sri Lanka has gotten itself into. On one hand, the government was spending more than it could afford, right? Expenditure was many times higher than the revenue. On the other hand, its production of goods and services and its exports had taken a big hit at a time when its imports were rising, its imports were shooting up. Now this is a worst case scenario for any country. And please know that Sri Lanka is a small country. It's an island nation, right? Its population is hardly 22 million, and Sri Lanka is heavily dependent on few sectors for its revenue, for its income. For example, Sri Lanka has a major dependency on tourism. It depends heavily on fisheries. It has a dependency on certain agricultural products like tea, rubber, rice, etc. So these are the major sources of revenue for Sri Lanka: tourism, few agricultural exports, and fisheries. The Sri Lankan economy was not so well diversified. So in such a situation, if the government is spending more than it could afford, if it is borrowing excessively, if it is repeatedly dipping into the forex reserves, and if it is trying to sustain very high level imports when the exports are low, naturally the trade deficit is going to shoot up. A BOP crisis was bound to happen, and the fiscal deficit continued to remain high. So this was a classic twin deficit situation that Sri Lanka had gotten itself into, and this was clearly highlighted in a report of the Asian Development Bank. But now the question is, what led Sri Lanka into this situation? Didn't Sri Lanka know that it was getting into this difficulty? What really contributed to this crisis? See, if we were to trace the origin of this crisis, you can go all the way back to the colonial era, to the independence of Sri Lanka, and to the root of its social and political problems. Today's economic crisis, it hasn't happened overnight. It has a history behind it. If you trace the Sri Lankan history over the decades, since 1948, that is when Sri Lanka became independent, or even if you go back to the colonial times, the root causes can be found over there. The Sri Lankan economy always had some structural issues, right? The Sri Lankan society had a major divide. All these factors have indeed contributed to the crisis you're witnessing today. But for the sake of our discussion, let's not go back all the way to Sri Lanka's colonial past. Let's not go into the details of its social divide. Let's just focus on the proximate causes, the immediate causes which have contributed to the current crisis. But you should know that Sri Lanka has seen a widespread ethnic and communal conflict, right? I hope you know that Sri Lanka is a majority Sinhala Buddhist nation. The majority ethnicity in Sri Lanka are the Sinhalese. And majority of the Sinhalese, they are followers of Buddhism. So in the country, Sinhala Buddhists are in majority. Is that clear? Whereas the Tamils, the other ethnic group, they were in minority. The Tamil minorities, they were an ethnic group, whereas the Sinhala Buddhists were the majority ethnic group. And also, apart from the divide between the Sinhala Buddhists and the Tamil minorities, which is primarily an ethnic divide, there has also been a communal religious divide in the country as well between the radical Sinhala Buddhists and the Muslim minorities. So Sri Lanka has a disastrous history behind it. It has a history where the minorities have been targeted, they have been abused, there have been war crimes committed in the country. Beginning from 1970s, Sri Lanka has witnessed a civil war between the Sinhala Buddhist majority and the Tamil minorities. Because Tamil minorities who were oppressed for decades together since independence, they rose up in rebellion. They formed their own militant organizations like the LTTE. This pushed Sri Lanka into a civil war back in the 1980s, 1990s. This civil war lasted for more than 3 decades. And as the civil war continued, as minorities like Tamils and Muslims were discriminated and oppressed in the country by the radical Sinhala Buddhist majority, majoritarian policies became popular. The policies favoring the Sinhala Buddhist majority became popular. So as a result, the governments which were formed in Sri Lanka were largely majoritarian governments which were authoritative, which were behaving in a dictatorial manner, which were known to violate democratic rights, human rights, etc. Generally, when you have such authoritative politics in place, chances are very high that the policies would be designed to please the majoritarian community. The policies will not make economic sense or scientific rationale or logic would be missing in government policies when authoritarian governments are running a country. So there is this past history as well which has contributed to the crisis. You can trace the origin all the way back to Sri Lanka's social and political problems. But let's come away from that. Let's look at the post-war era. Right? Sri Lanka's ethnic war ended in 2009. That is when the LTTE was defeated. Since then, Sri Lanka opened a new chapter. The ethnic war had come to an end. It was focusing on recovery and development post-2009. So let's start our analysis from here and see what happened in the last 13 or 15 years, which has pushed Sri Lanka into this grave economic crisis. Like I said, Sri Lanka's economic fortunes are very limited because Sri Lanka doesn't have a diversified economy. It is heavily dependent on few sectors like fisheries, tourism, exports of tea, rubber, garments, then even export of rice, etc. These are the limited sources of revenue for Sri Lanka. Upon this, Sri Lanka was heavily dependent on foreign remittances received from its diaspora abroad. Sri Lankans who are living abroad, working in other countries, they would send back precious remittances, which was increasing the forex reserves of Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka was adding up its forex reserves over the years, mainly through these exports of few select commodities, which were the strength areas of Sri Lanka, then through forex reserves earned through tourism, through foreign tourists who were coming into the country, and through remittances that was coming into the country through the Sri Lankan diaspora. These were the primary sources of foreign currency to Sri Lanka. This was sufficient for Sri Lanka to sustain its debt, to sustain its imports. But over the last 15 years, there have been many adverse developments. There have been many factors which have contributed to the current crisis that the country is witnessing. The primary blame, the primary responsibility lies with successive governments of Sri Lanka which have blatantly mismanaged its economy, especially the Rajapaksa government. You might have heard about Mahinda Rajapaksa. You can see him in the image over here. Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president of Sri Lanka between 2005 and 2015. During this period, his brother, you can see him in this image over here, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he was the defense minister. The Rajapaksa family is very influential in the country. The Rajapaksa brothers, they occupy key positions in the government, including few other family members. They come from the Sinhala Buddhist majority stronghold. Their primary political support base comes from the Sinhala Buddhist majority class. Their policies have largely been conservative and authoritative, and it was Mahinda Rajapaksa who launched the last phase of the civil war in Sri Lanka, which lasted between 2006 and 2009. This was when the final phase of the war was launched against the LTTE, and eventually the LTTE was defeated. But during this war period, between 2006 and 2009, when Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president, government expenditure went up significantly. The government started spending excessively on security, on defense, as it was fighting the last phase of the civil war. The government was spending more than it could afford. This was a period where Sri Lanka got closer to China. It started borrowing heavily from China for infrastructure projects and started taking massive loans from China and other global institutions. So such economic mismanagement has continued over the years. Today, in Sri Lanka, it is Gotabaya Rajapaksa who is the president, who was the former defense minister, right? Mahinda Rajapaksa has now become the prime minister. So basically, Rajapaksa brothers have come back to power in 2019. And after they came back to power, their economic mismanagement has continued. And it's not just the Rajapaksa government. Even before them, even the other governments, they have contributed to economic mismanagement in the country. There has been irresponsible spending, wasteful expenditure on unnecessary projects, heavy borrowing from institutions and other countries. So all these have contributed to Sri Lanka's debt burden. It has pushed itself into a debt burden, and it has even borrowed heavily from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. See, the problem is when a country borrows from the IMF, it always comes with conditions. You have to fulfill certain conditions to be eligible for IMF loans. You have to satisfy these criteria. Basically, when you take such assistance from IMF, you are compromising your economic sovereignty. Your monetary policy, fiscal policy will have to be changed as per the directions of the IMF. So there is an impact, there is a consequence for borrowing from the IMF. And Sri Lanka has taken the hit because of this as well. On one hand, it fell under the debt burden of all the foreign loans taken from countries like China, India, Japan, etc. On the other hand, it borrowed heavily from institutions like IMF, the Asian Development Bank, and it has also raised foreign borrowings through international sovereign bonds. By issuing sovereign bonds, Sri Lanka has been raising a lot of funds from the global markets. But this is all borrowed money. Through such borrowed money, Sri Lanka was running the government. And this borrowed money was being wasted on unnecessary expenditure. So this economic mismanagement, followed by irresponsible borrowing and expenditure, and the impact of IMF loans and the conditions imposed by IMF, they've all contributed to the current crisis in Sri Lanka. You should also know that the Sri Lankan economy has a structural problem. Like I said, its economy is not so well diversified, and over a period of time, its economy had slowed down, and its domestic production and exports were declining in the last 15 years. This was a period where Sri Lanka's imports started rising. So added to all these problems, there have been many external shocks to the Sri Lankan economy. Later, I'm going to discuss these recent shocks to the Sri Lankan economy. There have been some disastrous policies adopted by the Rajapaksa government. These disastrous economic policies of Rajapaksa government has directly contributed to the current crisis. There have been some external events which have been outside of Sri Lanka's control, which have also added to the problem. So all these factors combined together have led Sri Lanka to face this unprecedented situation. Now, just to trace back the history over here, I will take you back to the period between 2005 and 2009. As I mentioned earlier, this was a period when Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president of the country. He had launched the last phase of the war against the LTTE. This was the last phase of the civil war. During this period, Sri Lanka started spending heavily on defense and security because the conservative authoritarian government, it was trying to please its majority vote bank, the Sinhala Buddhist majority, by targeting the Tamil minorities, by targeting the Tamil militant outfit. It made a priority to wipe out the LTTE. In this process, Sri Lanka spent heavily on its defense, military and security expenditure. Later, it got closer to China as well and started borrowing heavily from China during the period. I'm sure you know that this was a period where the world witnessed an economic crisis back in 2008-2009. Back in 2008-2009, the global economy was hit by the subprime crisis, the global recession, right? This global financial crisis, it led to a flight of capital from developing countries. Foreign capital started fleeing all the developing markets and started heading back towards developed and stable economies like the US. So when the economic crisis hit, right, there was a flight of capital from Sri Lanka as well. Sri Lanka's forex reserves started depleting at a time when the government had increased its expenditure and borrowing. So in 2009, Sri Lanka was forced to take the help of IMF. This was the first major borrowing from the Sri Lankan government, from the IMF. But this borrowing, like I said, comes with conditions. It's not that IMF is doing charity over here. The IMF comes with its own agenda, which is to serve the interests of the developed Western countries, which dominate the IMF. I hope you know that IMF is dominated by US and the West European countries, which are members of the European Union. They largely look to fulfill their interests through these institutions such as IMF and the World Bank. So whatever assistance they give out, it is conditional. It comes with its own consequences. So Sri Lanka was forced to take an IMF loan in 2009 when the global financial crisis had hit, and it accepted IMF's conditions to keep the fiscal deficit under 5% of its GDP. Meaning the government had to curb its expenditure. The government couldn't spend wherever it wanted. It couldn't give stimulus to the economy when the economy was actually struggling as a result of the 2008 global financial crisis. Because when this financial crisis happened, and when foreign capital was fleeing the developing markets, the first step a country should have taken was to introduce a stimulus. The government should have given an economic stimulus to boost growth and domestic production. That is exactly what India had done in 2008-2009. The then Indian government came out with a massive economic stimulus package. The government increased its spending, its budgetary spending, without worrying about the fiscal deficit for a short period. The idea was to stimulate growth, boost production, improve our GDP growth and improve our exports. This is what ideally Sri Lanka also should have done. But Sri Lanka couldn't do it because it had accepted a condition that it will not increase its fiscal deficit beyond 5%. Right? This happened because the Rajapaksa government had already borrowed because of its heavy expenditure, because of its borrowing from other countries and from other institutions. Then later in 2013, the global commodity prices, they started crashing. Around the world, all major commodity prices, they started declining. This took a big hit on the Sri Lankan economy. As a result, Sri Lanka's exports started declining. And unfortunately for Sri Lanka, its imports started rising parallelly. So this was a worst case scenario that was presenting to itself to Sri Lanka. On one hand, the global economy was not doing so well. The commodity prices were falling. Sri Lanka was already under a debt burden. At the same time, exports went down. Its domestic production took a hit and imports started increasing. Even at this point, Sri Lanka could have saved itself if Sri Lanka had the autonomy to run its own economic policies. But again, the Rajapaksa government was curtailed. It couldn't come out with the fiscal stimulus or the fiscal policies that were needed to boost growth and production because it had borrowed loans from the IMF. It had actually taken one more loan in 2013, around $2.6 billion were borrowed by Sri Lanka again. So Sri Lanka was under a lot of constraints from the IMF. It couldn't spend the way it wanted. It couldn't give the right stimulus when it was needed to boost growth and production. So as a result, Sri Lanka's economy was stagnating. The structural crisis in its economy was increasing, and exports were declining and imports were going up. And all the while, the Sri Lankan government couldn't do anything. It stood and watched, kept increasing its wasteful expenditure, kept increasing its borrowing from other countries and from other institutions. This is how the foundation was laid for Sri Lanka's economic collapse. Then what happened? Between 2015 and 2019, we had a different government in Sri Lanka. Mahinda Rajapaksa lost the elections in 2015. His government was replaced by a new government headed by President Maithripala Sirisena. His government also continued the same policies because Sri Lanka was already caught in this economic mess. To come out of the crisis, the Maithripala Sirisena government increased government borrowing from the IMF. It took even more loans in 2016 and borrowed $1.5 billion again from the IMF with a new condition that the fiscal deficit will be kept limited to 3.5%. Meaning there was a new cap on government expenditure. The government couldn't spend it couldn't spend the way it wanted to give stimulus to the local production and to the local markets. So Sri Lanka was descending step by step into this chaos, into this crisis. So when Sri Lanka kept increasing its loans and borrowing from the IMF, the conditions also kept increasing. The IMF ensured that Sri Lanka had to reform its tax policies and tax administration. Taxes had to be brought down, which would in turn affect government revenue. This was an IMF condition to provide further loans and assistance. Then Sri Lanka had to control its expenditure to keep the fiscal deficit under check, to keep it under 3.5%. It had to privatize some of the large public enterprises, public companies, especially the companies which are importing petroleum products. They had to be privatized by Sri Lanka, right? Along with this, exchange rate couldn't be fixed by the Sri Lankan government. It had to be kept flexible as per the market conditions. Demand supply of foreign currency would determine the exchange rates. So like this, the Sri Lankan economy was opened up for foreign investment. The Sri Lankan economy had to be liberalized, it had to be opened up, and Sri Lanka had to abide by a host of conditions that were placed on it by the IMF. The idea was to drive more foreign investments, especially Western investments, into the country, and this is the cost that Sri Lanka had to pay for relying heavily on borrowing from the IMF. Parallelly, Sri Lanka kept borrowing from the international market as well by issuing more and more sovereign bonds. It kept issuing international sovereign bonds to keep raising new finance. Eventually, Sri Lanka was trapping itself into a debt burden. This is exactly what happened. The IMF package dealt a severe blow to Sri Lanka's economic health, and this was aggravated by the poor economic policies of the Rajapaksa government and by the other subsequent governments. So along with this, Sri Lanka witnessed a situation where its debt to GDP ratio started shooting up. You can clearly see in the graph over here how Sri Lanka's debt to GDP ratio has increased over the last few years. It has increased to an alarming 40%. It was more than 40% in the last 2-3 years. Now this is very, very alarming because a country facing such numbers of debt to GDP ratio would find it very difficult to honor the repayment commitments. The country may not be able to continue its debt repayment, and eventually it might be staring at a sovereign default, meaning the country will go bankrupt, right? As a result, the credit rating agencies, they started noticing this trend in Sri Lanka. They noticed that Sri Lanka's debt burden was mounting. It was increasing exponentially. Its forex reserves were depleting, exports were declining, and imports kept increasing. By looking at these conditions, credit rating agencies, they downgraded Sri Lanka's sovereign debt. There was a sovereign downgrade of Sri Lanka. It basically meant Sri Lanka may not be in a position to repay the debts. It meant Sri Lanka could face bankruptcy. So when your credit ratings are downgraded, no one is going to lend money to you. So this cut off foreign capital for Sri Lanka. As a credit rating was downgraded over the last couple of years, Sri Lanka could no longer access foreign capital easily by issuing bonds or by borrowing from institutions and from other countries. Here in this chart over here, you can see as to who are the major investors, the major donors into the Sri Lankan economy. You can see the split up of Sri Lanka's foreign debt. As I mentioned, Sri Lanka's biggest source of foreign funding is from capital markets. It has directly borrowed from the capital markets by issuing international sovereign bonds. So when these bonds mature, Sri Lanka has to pay back. It has to pay back the investors who had provided those loans, that too with interest. So majority of its borrowing is from the global capital markets. You can see clearly in this graph over here. It has also borrowed from institutions like IMF and World Bank. It has borrowed from ADB, Asian Development Bank, and also from countries like China, Japan, and India. Sri Lanka's loans from China accounts to around 10% of its total debt. In the case of India, it's just around 2%. But all in all, Sri Lanka's foreign burden, or essentially what we call as debt burden, kept increasing over the years. And Sri Lanka was pushing itself into a debt trap. To repay the debt and to continue its imports, Sri Lanka had no other option but to utilize its forex reserves. So forex reserves kept depleting, and today it has reached a situation where it is staring at a BOP crisis, meaning it doesn't have enough foreign currency to continue imports. It doesn't have enough currency to repay the loans it has borrowed. This is what brings Sri Lanka to this crisis situation. These are the root problems, the fundamental problems. The historical, political, social problems, the economic mismanagement by subsequent governments, irrational policies of Rajapaksa government, the impact of IMF borrowing, and the impact of excessive borrowing. These are the primary causes which has pushed Sri Lanka into this crisis. Upon this, Sri Lanka has faced some bad luck as well. There have been some recent events which have dealt a severe shock to Sri Lanka's economy. Unfortunately, many of them were not in Sri Lanka's hands, but it has simply aggravated the problem. For example, the Easter Sunday terror attacks, which happened in 2019, carried out a major bombing in Sri Lanka where multiple churches were bombed on Easter Sunday. Hundreds of people were killed and injured. This was the biggest terror attack Sri Lanka was witnessing in many, many years. So this attack increased instability in the country. It opened up its political social divide, right? Especially the divide between the Sinhala Buddhist majority and the Muslim minorities. So as a result, tourism took a big hit after this attack. Foreign tourists, especially from Western countries, from Russia, from China and the others, they started staying away from Sri Lanka because it was a high-risk country. So Sri Lanka's tourism sector took a big hit after these terror attacks. Then, in 2019, when Sri Lanka went for fresh elections, the Rajapaksa brothers who were contesting again, they made some unrealistic promises to the voters. They came out with many populist promises to impress the voters in order to win the elections. They promised a lot of benefits to the farmers, which would increase government subsidies. They also promised deep tax cuts to help the companies and the Sri Lankan people. These policies were not rooted in economic logic. There was no economic rationale behind these policies. These were populist measures that were promised by the Rajapaksa brothers just to win the elections, despite the grave situation of the Sri Lankan economy. After they won the election, in the last 2 years, they have implemented many of these irrational economic policies. In the last few months, Sri Lanka has cut its taxes deeply. Both direct and indirect taxes have been cut. The idea was to benefit the Sri Lankan population and the Sri Lankan companies, hoping that this would boost growth and boost domestic production by putting more money in the hands of the people. But this didn't happen because there are other structural problems which were never addressed. So there was no question of boosting growth and production just by cutting taxes. So cutting taxes had only one impact, which hit the government revenue. The government revenue, which was already declining, took a much bigger hit after the taxes were cut. because both indirect and direct taxes were cut deeply by the Rajapaksa government. So as the government revenue collapsed, the fiscal deficit crisis increased exponentially in the country. The fiscal deficit shot up because the government's unnecessary expenditure kept continuing. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic. When the pandemic hit the world and pushed countries around the world into a lockdown, Sri Lanka was also not spared. So these lockdowns, the pandemic restrictions, they had a devastating impact on the Sri Lankan economy because tourism came to a standstill for nearly 2 years. Its primary source of revenue dried up. There were no foreign tourists coming into the country for almost 2 years. Remittances coming from the foreign workers from Sri Lankan diaspora also dried up because Sri Lankan diaspora working in other countries, they lost their jobs because of the pandemic and the lockdowns. They all came back to Sri Lanka after losing their jobs. So foreign remittances also started drying up. Plus the government expenditure increased on healthcare. Because of the pandemic, the government health expenditure had to go up, right? So these were again unfortunate developments which hit the Sri Lankan economy very hard. Then came a disastrous policy of the Rajapaksa brothers. President Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, overnight, he announced a ban on all chemical fertilizers. He announced overnight that the country is switching to organic farming. And there was no scientific basis for this. This government policy, it was disastrous. It was based in pseudoscience. See, you should know that Sri Lanka was largely importing fertilizers. It was paying a lot of money to import fertilizers. But since Sri Lanka was struggling to sustain imports, what the Sri Lankan government decided was it will switch its agriculture overnight to organic farming, thereby reduce the need for importing fertilizers, thereby saving forex reserves. And for this purpose, Sri Lankan government declared an overnight ban on chemical fertilizers. This policy was implemented for a few months despite all scientific evidence. Officials, agricultural experts, they kept warning that this would be disastrous because it would destroy agriculture production, especially the key products of Sri Lanka, that is tea, rubber, rice and other essentials. So as predicted, Sri Lanka's agri output, its agriculture production took a big hit, and finally the policy was reversed last year in November 2021. After a few months, the ban on chemical fertilizers was reversed. But by this time, the Sri Lankan agriculture sector had taken the hit. Its production levels had been affected. It was resulting in shortage of essential items, and Sri Lanka's key exports, such as tea, rubber, rice, they had taken a big hit. Now imagine the time during which it happened. Sri Lanka was already facing a dire economic situation. At this point, a disastrous policy was implemented to ban chemical fertilizers, and based on pseudoscience, a switch was made to organic farming. So as a result, its agri exports went down. There was a shortage of essential food items and food supplies, triggering inflation in the country. So this was another shock event. Then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has disrupted global supply chains and increased global oil prices. Now Sri Lanka finally came to a situation where it could no longer continue imports. It couldn't import oil anymore. It didn't have enough forex reserves. Like I said earlier, it was just left with around $2 billion in February. If I'm not wrong, by the end of March, this number has gone down to $1.93 billion. And do you know how much Sri Lanka needs to pay debts in this year? It needs at least $4 billion in 2022 just to repay the loans, just to honor the debt commitments. So where will Sri Lanka import? Where will it pay for the imports? That is why imports had to be frozen. Import bans were placed, creating a massive shortage of all essential supplies. So this was the breaking point. This was the breaking point, right? So as a result, the people who were suffering, there were no supplies on the ground. Even basic food items, medicines were not available. Massive power cuts were hitting production and daily lives. So people took to the streets, they started protesting, calling for accountability from the government. They wanted the Rajapaksa brothers to step down. So this led to protests, clashes and violence, and eventually a state of emergency was imposed. curfews were placed in the country to curb the violence that was spreading. So in short, these factors have together contributed to Sri Lanka's grave economic crisis. It's a combination of its historical imbalances in its economic structure, which is a result of its colonial past, a result of its political social divide. It's also a result of the impact of IMF loans and conditions placed by the IMF. And these factors have been further aggravated because of the misguided policies of authoritarian governments, such as the Rajapaksa government, which has tried to please the majoritarian community at the cost of the minorities. Along with this, the government's embrace of pseudoscience, the irrational tax cuts, overnight switch to organic farming and ban on chemical fertilizers. These were unscientific, irrational economic policies which destroyed Sri Lanka's economy. Then, of course, there were other factors over which Sri Lanka had no control, such as the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, etc. But these factors have just amplified the problems for Sri Lanka. So now what can Sri Lanka do? What is Sri Lanka planning to do? Sri Lanka has very limited options from here on. It has no other option but to work out an IMF bailout package. It has to go back to the IMF, seek emergency assistance to bail out the economy. But this will of course come with fresh conditions from the IMF, but Sri Lanka has no other option. It has to go for more borrowing from the IMF. Otherwise, Sri Lanka will risk default in a few months. It will go bankrupt. It will result in a complete economic collapse. To avoid that from happening, to just sustain the economy and revive it back, it has to work out an economic package, a bailout package from the IMF. Apart from that, Sri Lanka is trying to restructure the other loans or defer the loan repayment that it owes to other institutions and other countries. It is requesting other countries which have donated money to defer the loan repayment, to give it more time to pay back. They've been asked by Sri Lanka to restructure the debt, to restructure the loan itself. So Sri Lanka has approached donors like India and China for immediate emergency assistance to help Sri Lanka sustain its day-to-day life, to sustain basic imports of fuel and medicine. Along with that, it has asked India, China to defer the pending loans and to restructure the existing debt so that Sri Lanka will get a breathing space. In that small window that Sri Lanka will get, it is looking to take an economic package from IMF through which it might try to revive the Sri Lankan economy. This is the only option left for Sri Lanka. That's the reason why India has stepped in and it has tried providing Sri Lanka with all possible assistance. Because mind you, Sri Lanka is a very, very important neighbor, right? I already told you that Sri Lanka is in a strategic location in the Indian Ocean. The Indian influence in Sri Lanka has been challenged by China since 2005. Especially the Rajapaksa brothers, they have been perceived to be closer to China. They have taken many pro-China policies in the past and they have largely taken a stand against India in the last 15 years. So this is an opportunity for India to gain back its influence, to counter the Chinese influence with the Rajapaksa brothers. So that is why India proactively responded to the calls for help coming from the Rajapaksa government. In the last few months itself, India has given out around $2.4 billion in assistance, in emergency assistance. Okay? We have provided $400 million as a currency swap arrangement under the SARC framework. India's central bank, RBI, Reserve Bank of India, will provide a currency swap facility to the Sri Lankan central bank of $400 million so that Sri Lanka will get a breathing space with regard to its forex reserves. We have announced a $500 million loan, a new loan, which is basically being deferred for the payment that was pending from the Asian Clearing Union. Sri Lanka was supposed to pay back India through the Asian Clearing Union, which is based out of Turkey. This is actually an old loan that Sri Lanka had taken from India. It was supposed to pay back this year. It was supposed to pay $500 million to India through this financial institution known as Asian Clearing Union based out of Turkey. But because of the crisis, India has agreed to defer the loan repayment. India has said you need not pay this amount right away. So we are deferring this loan repayment. We are restructuring the loan itself which is worth around $500 million. Apart from this, two new loans are being announced by India. Two fresh line of credits have been announced worth around $500 million and $1 billion each. The $500 million line of credit was given for importing fuel from India, because few weeks back Sri Lanka didn't have any money to import fuel, that is to import basic oil, petrol and diesel. So India gave an emergency line of credit, emergency loan of $500 million to continue importing oil from India, and it has announced another line of credit of $1 billion to help Sri Lanka procure food, medicine and other essential supplies and items from India. If you remember, when the pandemic broke out in 2020, India actually gave out medical supplies to Sri Lanka through Mission Sagar. India had run a humanitarian mission across Indian Ocean known as Mission Sagar. Through this initiative, Indian Navy had supplied medicines and other medical items to many countries in the Indian Ocean, including Sri Lanka. Even then, Sri Lanka needed India's help when the pandemic had started, because Sri Lanka was facing this grave crisis. Now the crisis has just aggravated. So to help Sri Lanka to continue with basic supplies, basic imports, we have announced new line of credits of $500 million and $1 billion, and we have even sent more ships with essential supplies like sugar, rice, wheat. All these essential supplies have been sent by India in the last few weeks. And just a few days back, India has announced that it is open to investing another $2 billion to help out Sri Lanka. India has said it's ready to provide another $2 billion in assistance. This is mainly because India is keeping an eye on China, what China is doing. Till date, China has parallelly announced an assistance of $2.8 billion. This roughly matches India's assistance of $2.4 billion. But in the coming weeks and coming months, China has promised to help Sri Lanka with another $2.5 billion. So in total, China would provide an assistance of nearly $5 billion to Sri Lanka to help the country overcome the crisis. So that would definitely make China more prominent and influential in the country. And as you saw earlier, out of Sri Lanka's total foreign debt, 10% of the debt is from China. So China always has that leverage. In fact, it is said that China uses this leverage for geopolitical reasons. I'm sure you know that China funded a port in Sri Lanka known as the Hambantota port. This port project failed to generate revenue. Sri Lanka couldn't repay the loan. Eventually, Sri Lanka was forced to give away this project to a Chinese company for a long-term lease. This is how China has been gaining control of strategic projects by investing in such unviable economic projects in smaller countries. This strategy of China is referred to as the debt trap diplomacy of China. So Sri Lanka has already fallen under China's debt trap, right? So China has that leverage, that influence over Sri Lanka. If this were to increase further, if China were to provide $5 billion in emergency assistance, then definitely Chinese influence is going to increase, which would counter Indian influence, which would affect Indian interests as well. So that is why India is looking to match China's assistance. We've already given an assistance of $2.4 billion in the last few weeks, and we are ready, we are open to providing another assistance of $2 billion. But experts are questioning how far will this assistance from India, China really help Sri Lanka? Because the assistance being given by India, China, it is not charity again. It's not a donation. It's not grant or aid. It is again a loan. They are just restructuring the existing loans, deferring the loan repayments and providing new line of credits, which are basically new loans. So basically the debt burden will increase on Sri Lanka. So if Sri Lanka manages to utilize this assistance, trigger economic growth and overcome the crisis, then well and good. Or else, Sri Lanka will just postpone the crisis by few months, by few years, but it will face the same situation again in a short while. This is the difficult situation that Sri Lanka has gotten itself into. That's why many experts have said that the assistance from India, China, IMF, it may not really help Sri Lanka, because these are just new loans being given out. It will increase the burden on Sri Lanka. But unfortunately, Sri Lanka has no other way out. To avoid a total default, to avoid a complete collapse of the economy, it has to take loans from IMF and accept IMF conditions, even though it has a negative impact. It has to agree for more loans from India and China and agree for loan deferment, because Sri Lanka has no other option, right? This only buys some time for Sri Lanka. It will give Sri Lanka some additional time, maybe a few months, maybe a year or two, within which Sri Lanka has to stage an economic recovery. Its domestic production, GDP growth has to go up. Its exports has to increase. Government expenditure has to be curtailed, and fiscal deficit and trade deficit has to be brought down. So this requires prudent economic policies from the Sri Lankan government. The irresponsible policies cannot continue. The economic mismanagement cannot continue anymore. As of now, it's very difficult to say how things will progress in Sri Lanka, but let us wait and watch what the Rajapaksa government is going to do. The protests are a sign for the Sri Lankan government that if the crisis is not handled, the people will take up violence on the streets. It might result in the collapse of the Sri Lankan government itself. Now, India doesn't want that. We don't want instability, political instability in our neighborhood, right? So India is also closely watching these developments, trying to give as much assistance as possible. But as of now, it is too early to conclude whether Sri Lanka will come out of this crisis quickly. Definitely, Sri Lanka will need few months, maybe a couple of years to overcome the crisis, but that will require prudent economic management. So let's wait and watch how the Sri Lankan government is going to handle the crisis. With this, I would like to bring the discussion to an end because we have covered the crisis in Sri Lanka, the factors responsible for it, its impact, and what is India doing to assist the Sri Lankan government. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching, and if you like the session, don't forget to like the video, share your comments, and please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Thanks for watching. Good night.